My husband and mother-in-law humiliated me in front of 200 guests at our 10th anniversary party. They ordered me to leave the estate they thought they owned, completely unaware that I was the secret founder of the real estate trust that controlled their entire lives. I walked out without shedding a single tear. 30 minutes later, I initiated a lockdown that turned their high society celebration into a prison of their own making. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled a dynasty of deceit in a single night. The warm Atlanta evening breeze carried the scent of expensive catering and imported orchids across the manicured lawns of the Buckhead estate. It was supposed to be a celebration of a decade of marriage between me and Marcus. He was a highly visible finance director, a man who loved the spotlight and the status that came with his position in the affluent African American community. I was Maya, the quiet wife, the woman who stayed in the background making sure his life ran flawlessly. For 10 years, I swallowed my pride. I woke up at 5 every morning to manage the household. I endured the passive-aggressive remarks about my humble beginnings. I sacrificed my own comfort to maintain the illusion of their perfect family. Tonight, 200 of the city's elite gathered around the glowing infinity pool. Women in silk evening gowns and men in tailored suits held crystal champagne flutes, their laughter echoing against the stone facade of the mansion. I stood near the edge of the patio wearing a simple but elegant black dress, watching my mother-in-law, Beatrice, command the attention of a group of local politicians. Beatrice wore a vibrant red designer gown, her hair styled to perfection, projecting the image of absolute matriarchal power. She had always made it clear that my working-class roots were a stain on her carefully cultivated family legacy. Every conversation with her was a battlefield of subtle insults. Even tonight, as guests complimented the floral arrangements I had personally selected, Beatrice loudly claimed she had hired a new exclusive event planner to mask my lack of taste. The string quartet stopped playing as Beatrice tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter, drawing all eyes to the grand marble staircase that led down to the pool deck. Marcus stood beside her, looking effortlessly handsome in his custom tuxedo, a confident smirk playing on his lips. The sudden shift in the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Everyone please gather around," Beatrice announced into a microphone. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with a false sweetness that immediately put me on high alert. "Tonight, we are supposed to celebrate 10 years of marriage for my son Marcus and his wife Maya. 10 years is a long time. It is a time for reflection, for evaluating investments, and for recognizing when a partnership has simply run its course." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt the collective gaze of 200 guests shift toward me. I kept my posture straight, my face entirely neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing my heart pound. I had spent a decade building a tolerance to her cruelty, but taking this to a public stage was a new level of hostility. "Maya, darling, come up here," Beatrice called out, gesturing toward the stairs. I walked slowly across the pool deck, the click of my heels barely audible over the sudden oppressive silence of the guests. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Marcus did not reach out to help me up. He simply stood there, his hands deep in his pockets, watching me with cold amusement. The look in his eyes was entirely devoid of the man I thought I had married. Usually on a 10th anniversary, a husband gifts his wife diamonds. Beatrice continued, turning to face the crowd. "But we believe in gifts that reflect a person's true nature and their actual value to this family. We believe in authenticity." She reached behind the floral arrangement on the banister and pulled out a crumpled gray industrial cleaning apron. It was stained and frayed, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding us. She tossed it down the stairs. It landed right at my feet, a heap of dirty canvas on the pristine white marble. "That is for you," Maya, Beatrice said, her voice echoing through the sound system. "A reminder of where you came from and where you truly belong. You are nothing but a glorified housekeeper who got lucky. You dragged your poverty into our home, and for 10 years we tolerated the stench of your working-class background. But this family represents excellence. We represent the pinnacle of success in Atlanta. You do not fit the brand. You never did. The humiliation was designed to break me. I could see it in the way the guests exchanged shocked, gleeful glances. I could hear the stifled snickers from women who had pretended to be my friends just hours earlier. They expected me to crumble, to cry, to beg for my dignity. They wanted a public breakdown to justify their elitism. I looked down at the apron. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream. I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over me. The years of trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me evaporated in an instant. I realized that my silence had never been a shield. It had only been permission for them to strike harder. Marcus finally stepped forward. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and held it out to me. "Sign these, Maya," he demanded, dropping his charming facade entirely. "They are divorce papers. My lawyers have already drawn them up. You leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which is absolutely nothing. I have carried your dead weight for a decade. I need a wife who elevates my status, someone who understands high society, not someone who shrinks in the presence of real power. You are holding me back." I looked at the envelope in his extended hand. I looked at the man I had spent 10 years supporting, the man whose early career mistakes I had quietly fixed, whose debts I had silently paid off. He genuinely believed he was the architect of his own success. He had completely forgotten the nights I stayed up reviewing his contracts, correcting the financial errors that would have destroyed his reputation before it even began. "You want me to leave?" I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly, even without a microphone. "I want you out of my house tonight," Marcus sneered, his voice laced with venom. "Pack whatever cheap clothes you own and take the back door. Do not make a scene. Just take your apron and disappear before you embarrass yourself further." As if on cue, the crowd parted slightly. A young, striking woman in a form-fitting emerald gown stepped forward and walked gracefully up the stairs to stand directly beside Marcus. She slipped her arm through his, resting her head on his shoulder. It was his junior financial analyst, a woman barely 25 years old, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I immediately recognized. I had seen the charge for it on a corporate account statement 3 weeks ago. "Meet the future of this family," Beatrice announced, placing a proud hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Someone who actually belongs in our world. Someone who brings value instead of draining it." The ultimate insult had been delivered. They had orchestrated a public execution of my marriage and my dignity, expecting me to run away in shame and never look back. They wanted to erase me from their perfect narrative. I slowly bent down, picked up the divorce papers, and left the dirty apron exactly where it lay. I looked Marcus directly in the eyes. I looked at Beatrice. I looked at the young woman clinging to his arm. I memorized the arrogance on their faces, locking it away to fuel what I was about to do. "I will sign these," I said, my voice eerily calm, "and I will leave you exactly as you requested." I turned my back on them and began walking away. Behind me, the string quartet resumed playing an upbeat tempo. I could hear Beatrice laughing, a sharp, victorious sound that cut through the night air. I heard the clinking of glasses as the guests resumed their drinking, eager to gossip about the dramatic expulsion of the unworthy wife. They thought they had won. They thought they had discarded a helpless dependent who would crawl away to hide in obscurity. But as I walked away from the pool deck, I did not head toward the back door. I did not head toward the driveway to call a ride into the city. I turned down a restricted, dimly lit corridor of the mansion leading toward the reinforced steel door of the master security control room. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. The heavy door clicked open, granting me access to the nerve center of the estate. The head of security stood up immediately, bowing his head in deep respect. "Good evening, madam," he said respectfully, waiting for my command. I sat down in the leather command chair, looking at the wall of monitors displaying the party outside. My husband and my mother-in-law were smiling, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. "Lock down the perimeter," I instructed. My eyes locked on Marcus' face on the screen. "Nobody leaves." and cut their credit access. Every single card. The show is just getting started. The emerald green silk of the young woman's dress caught the light of the fire pits, reflecting a brilliant toxic glow. She clung to Marcus with the desperate, eager grip of someone who believed she had just won the ultimate prize. I stared at her, then at Marcus, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence of 200 guests pressing down on my shoulders. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They were all waiting for the spectacular collapse of Maya, the working-class girl who had dared to infiltrate their pristine, exclusive ranks. Before I could even process the sheer volume of the betrayal standing right in front of me, a loud, obnoxious, slow clap broke the silence. Spencer stepped forward from the shadow of the cabana. He was Marcus's brother-in-law, married to Chloe, and he carried himself with the supreme, unquestioned arrogance of a man born on third base who genuinely believed he had hit a triple. He was a white real estate speculator who had spent the last decade using Marcus's family connections to infiltrate the affluent black community of Atlanta, draining their resources while secretly mocking their culture behind closed doors. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a condescending smirk plastered across his pale face. "Let us just be honest for a second, Maya," Spencer said, his voice projecting loudly across the pool deck. His tone was laced with that familiar, sickeningly polite condescension he always used when addressing me. "You gave it a good try. You really did. You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, put on the designer dresses we bought for you, and played the part of a high society wife. But a fresh coat of paint does not fix a crumbling foundation. There is a cultural mismatch here. You have always possessed a certain urban grit that simply does not align with the corporate excellence of this family." A few men in the crowd chuckled at his thinly veiled insults. Spencer fed on their amusement, his chest puffing out with unwarranted pride. "You never quite assimilated, did you?" Spencer continued, taking another step toward me, invading my personal space with his arrogant swagger. "You never understood the country club etiquette. You never knew the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy. You always looked like you were waiting for the other shoe to drop, like a terrified imposter waiting to be escorted out by security. Well, security is finally here. Marcus is doing what he should have done 5 years ago. He is cutting his losses and upgrading his portfolio." Spencer reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip. He peeled back a crisp $20 bill. He held it up to the light, making sure every single guest watching could see exactly what he was doing. "We are not completely heartless," Spencer mocked, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "We know you do not have any of your own money. We know you gave up your little administrative job to live off my brother-in-law. So here is the severance package." He opened his fingers. The $20 bill fluttered through the humid night air, twisting and turning before landing softly on the marble deck, right next to the stained industrial cleaning apron Beatrice had thrown at me moments earlier. "Take that and call yourself an Uber," Spencer sneered. "I hear there is a surge pricing tonight, so you might want to start walking toward the main gate to catch a cheaper ride. Go back to your old neighborhood, Maya. It is where you belong." The cruelty of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But the attack was not over. Chloe, my husband's younger sister, pushed her way through the crowd to stand beside her arrogant husband. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand, the bubbles catching the outdoor lighting. She wore a dress that cost more than my entire college tuition, paid for entirely by the credit cards I secretly managed behind the scenes. "Honestly, Maya, do not even walk toward the main gate," Chloe chimed in, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute disgust. "The paparazzi and the local society photographers are still out there taking pictures of the arriving guests. We cannot have you ruining the aesthetic of the evening by doing your walk of shame down the red carpet. It would be entirely too depressing to capture on film." She took a delicate sip of her champagne, looking me up and down, as if I were a piece of trash that had blown onto her pristine property. "Use the service entrance by the kitchens," Chloe commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the back of the mansion. "The catering staff is throwing out the garbage right now. You can just slip out right behind the dumpster trucks. Just please make sure you do not scuff the imported Italian marble floors on your way out. We just had them polished this morning." The guests erupted into genuine unfiltered laughter. The sound was deafening. It hit me from all sides, a tidal wave of mockery from the so-called elite of Atlanta. The invisible camera of the room's attention rapidly circled me, capturing every angle of my supposed defeat. They saw a woman stripped of her title, stripped of her dignity, and thrown to the wolves, but they could not see what was actually happening inside my mind. As I looked at Spencer, I did not see a powerful real estate mogul. I saw a pathetic, failing speculator whose last 3 commercial development projects had almost bankrupted him. He did not know that the massive anonymous holding company that had bailed out his firm just last month was entirely owned and operated by me. I owned his debt. I owned his company. I owned his future. As I looked at Chloe, I did not see an untouchable socialite. I saw a spoiled, reckless child who was millions of dollars in debt. She did not know that the offshore trust that silently covered her massive shopping sprees and luxury vacations was managed by my private wealth advisors. And as I looked at Marcus, I did not see a brilliant finance director. I saw a man who had built his entire towering career on my quiet, invisible genius. He had just handed me divorce papers that demanded I leave with exactly what I brought into the marriage. It was the most spectacular, beautiful mistake he could have possibly made. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not let a single emotion break through the cold, impenetrable mask on my face. The laughter around me slowly began to die down, as the crowd realized I was not giving them the dramatic weeping reaction they so desperately craved. The silence returned heavier and far more uncomfortable than before. I slowly bent down. My movements were deliberate, graceful, and completely unbothered. I ignored the crumpled $20 bill. I ignored the dirty, frayed cleaning apron. I reached out and picked up the thick manila envelope containing the divorce papers. I stood back up, smoothing the front of my black silk dress. I looked at Marcus one last time. I saw a brief, fleeting flash of confusion cross his eyes. He had expected me to fight. He had expected me to fall to my knees and beg for my comfortable life. My absolute terrifying calm unsettled him. I looked at the young woman in the green dress, offering her a chilling, predatory smile that made her visibly step back and clutch Marcus's arm tighter. "I will gladly use the exit you have provided," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. It will be the most memorable night of your entire lives." I turned my back on them. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, powerful stride of a queen surveying her conquered territory. The crowd of wealthy guests immediately parted for me, stepping aside as if they were suddenly terrified to touch my shadow. I walked away from the glowing pool, away from the lavish outdoor bar, and away from the family that had just signed their own financial death warrants. I stepped through the massive glass patio doors and into the grand foyer of the mansion. I could hear the faint sound of Marcus's voice floating in from outside, loudly assuring his guests that the minor distraction was over and the party would continue. He was already pouring another round of vintage champagne, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic storm that was gathering right inside his own walls. Chloe had told me to use the service entrance. Spencer had told me to walk to the main gate. I had absolutely no intention of doing either. I walked past the grand sweeping front staircase. I walked past the massive mahogany double doors that led to the front driveway. Instead, I took a sharp, decisive left turn, heading straight toward the east wing of the estate. This was the restricted corridor. It was a section of the house that Marcus expressly forbade anyone from entering, proudly boasting to his friends that it housed the highly classified, state-of-the-art security and property management systems for the entire 10-acre compound. He loved telling people that only the true owner of the estate could authorize access to that corridor. He was absolutely right. I reached the end of the dimly lit, windowless hallway. A massive reinforced steel door stood blocking my path, glowing with a sleek, high-tech biometric security panel. Marcus thought this system protected his kingdom. He thought his name was on the master deed. He had never bothered to read the incredibly complex, layered corporate structures I had designed when we first purchased the land. I did not hesitate. I raised my right hand and firmly pressed my thumb against the glowing green glass of the biometric scanner. The machine beeped a pleasant confirming tone. A mechanical voice echoed softly in the quiet hallway. Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Madam Director. The heavy steel locks disengaged with a series of loud, satisfying clicks. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The real party was about to begin. The climate-controlled air of the central security hub rushed over my face as the heavy door sealed shut behind me. This was the exact room Marcus loved to use as his ultimate bragging tool whenever he hosted his elite country club dinners. He would casually guide local politicians and wealthy executives down this restricted hallway just to puff out his chest and boast about the military-grade biometric security system protecting his magnificent estate. He always told his sycophantic friends that only the true master of the house possessed the absolute security clearance required to access the mainframe. The sheer irony was entirely lost on him. Marcus never realized that the system was hardwired to recognize my fingerprints and my retinal patterns, not his. He was merely an authorized guest in his own supposed kingdom, living on borrowed time and borrowed wealth. The room was a massive circular space, dominated by a curved wall of ultra-high-definition monitors. Every single square foot of the 10-acre property was under constant, unwavering surveillance. Sitting at the center of the massive control console was the chief of security. His name was Harrison, a former federal agent I had personally vetted, hired, and paid through my private holding company 3 years ago. I established that anonymous trust when I bought this land to protect my assets from Marcus and his reckless financial behavior. Harrison did not ask what I was doing there. He did not question why the woman who had just been publicly humiliated, handed divorce papers, and banished from the property was now standing inside the most secure room in the state of Georgia. He simply stood up from his leather chair, straightened his immaculate suit, clasped his hands behind his back, and offered a deep, incredibly respectful bow. "Good evening, Madam Director," Harrison said. His voice was steady, perfectly professional, and laced with absolute loyalty to the person who actually signed his checks. "We have been monitoring the entire situation on the pool deck. The team is on standby and awaiting your direct orders." I walked slowly toward the main console, my eyes tracking the live feeds from the dozens of outdoor cameras. The high-resolution lenses captured every single detail of the sickening celebration happening outside. The guests had quickly recovered from the shock of my departure and were now fully indulging in the drama. I could see the exact moment Marcus turned back to his audience, raising his hands in a victorious, arrogant gesture, as if he had just slain a dragon. The crowd was literally cheering for him. On another monitor, I watched Beatrice hugging the young mistress, welcoming the 25-year-old homewrecker into the fold of their toxic elitist circle. Beatrice was smiling so widely her face looked strained, absolutely thrilled that she had finally successfully purged the working-class burden from her pristine family tree. Over by the outdoor bar, Spencer and Chloe were enthusiastically clinking their crystal glasses together. Spencer was laughing loudly, undoubtedly making another derogatory joke about my background, completely unaware that his entire pathetic existence was hanging by a very thin thread that I controlled. They were openly celebrating my demise on a patio that I had paid for. They were drinking $15,000 bottles of champagne funded by the corporate credit cards that I secretly backed with my own private wealth. For 10 excruciating years, I let Marcus play the role of the self-made financial genius. I swallowed my ambition and played the submissive wife to protect his fragile, massive ego. When his reckless, arrogant investments nearly bankrupted his entire firm 5 years ago, it was my anonymous holding company that absorbed his massive debts and saved him from federal prison. I bought this magnificent estate through a shell corporation to protect him from his own aggressive creditors. I structured the entire family wealth into a complex web of independent trusts that legally belonged entirely to me. I gave him the illusion of absolute power because I believed that marriage meant protecting your partner at all costs. But he took that protection, claimed it as his own sheer brilliance, and used it as a weapon to crush me in front of the entire city. "Look at them," Harrison noted quietly, breaking the silence in the room as he adjusted a dial to bring the main pool deck camera into sharper focus. They genuinely believe they have won. Let them enjoy their beautiful illusion for a few more minutes, I replied. I stepped up to the primary command station and pulled up the master control interface on the glowing touchscreen panel. The system immediately prompted a secondary security measure. I leaned forward, looking directly into the scanner, letting the red laser sweep across my eye. Access granted flashed across the massive central screen in bold green letters. I now had total, unrestricted control over the physical and financial infrastructure of the entire Blackwell dynasty. The time for being the quiet, supportive wife was officially over. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you try to discard the architect of your entire universe. Harrison, I said, my eyes locked on the monitor, showing Marcus kissing his mistress on the cheek. Initiate protocol absolute lockdown. Seal the perimeter immediately. Harrison did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He began typing a rapid sequence of commands into his terminal. Yes, madam. Engaging heavy security doors. Locking all primary and secondary exit gates. Disabling all guest access codes and revoking staff override privileges. The compound is now entirely sealed. Nobody leaves or enters this property without your direct explicit authorization. On the security screens, I watched the massive wrought iron front gates of the estate slide shut with a heavy final thud. The thick security bolts locked into place automatically. The perimeter lighting instantly shifted from a soft, welcoming ambient glow to a stark, blinding security white. I watched as my highly trained armed security personnel quietly shifted their positions, blocking the driveway and the service entrances. The 200 wealthy guests, laughing and drinking around the infinity pool, were completely unaware that they were now trapped inside my fortress. They were entirely too busy mocking my exit to realize the steel trap had just snapped shut around their ankles. Now it was time for the real punishment. I minimized the security feeds and opened the financial dashboard on my console. This was the highly encrypted system I used to silently manage the family accounts, the exact same accounts Marcus thought were magically regenerating through his own spectacular career success. I pulled up the primary family trust. This was the massive, unrestricted fund that paid for Beatrice's designer gowns, covered Chloe's ridiculous shopping sprees, financed Spencer's failing real estate ventures, and maintained Marcus's lavish, arrogant lifestyle. I hovered my index finger over the master termination switch. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of justice. On the main camera monitor, the catering manager was rolling out a massive, towering pyramid of crystal glasses for the anniversary toast. Marcus was stepping up to a special display table holding a vintage custom-ordered bottle of champagne. It was the grand finale of the night, the moment where he would officially toast to his new life and his new socially acceptable partner. The catering manager politely handed Marcus the golden mobile payment terminal to process the final charge for the extravagant liquor before popping the cork. Marcus puffed out his chest, smiling warmly at his mistress. He casually took out his shiny black corporate card with a smug, arrogant flourish. He was ready to show off his unlimited, untouchable wealth to his adoring audience. He raised the card toward the payment terminal, preparing to swipe. I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifying smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I pressed my finger down firmly on the glowing red termination button on my screen. Harrison, I commanded, my voice echoing powerfully in the quiet control room. Terminate all financial access immediately. Deactivate every single credit card attached to their names. Freeze every linked bank account, and cut the main power grid to the outdoor entertainment system right now. Let us see how the untouchable elite handle the dark. The glowing red button beneath my fingertip clicked with a heavy, satisfying finality. Inside the climate-controlled security hub, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the servers and the rapid clicking of Harrison's keyboard as my orders bypassed every single firewall Marcus thought he controlled. I sat perfectly still in the leather command chair. The massive array of high-definition monitors illuminated the dark room, casting a cold blue light across my face. I watched the screens like a hawk. On the central monitor, the camera angle shifted, zooming in closely over my shoulder to capture the exact unfolding disaster on the pool deck. The timing was absolutely poetic. Marcus was standing at the pinnacle of his arrogance. The towering $10,000 champagne pyramid gleamed under the outdoor string lights. The young woman in the emerald green dress clung to his bicep, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Surrounding them, 200 of Atlanta's most elite socialites raised their empty crystal flutes, waiting for the lavish pour that would officially seal my erasure from their world. The catering manager, a sharply dressed man named Julian, who had worked my events for years, stepped forward. He held out the golden mobile payment terminal on a silver tray. Marcus did not even look at Julian. He was too busy soaking in the adoration of his peers. With a theatrical, highly exaggerated flourish, my husband pulled his solid metal black card from his tuxedo pocket. He held it up just long enough for the surrounding guests to admire the ultimate symbol of unlimited wealth before confidently tapping it against the screen of the terminal. I leaned closer to my monitor. I did not blink. Down on the pool deck, the terminal emitted a sharp, loud, discordant buzz. A bright red error bar flashed across Julian's screen. Marcus's victorious smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, smoothing his expression back into a mask of easy, unbothered wealth. He let out a loud, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head, as if the machine itself had committed a grave social faux pas. "These modern wireless terminals are always so temperamental," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice projecting a forced, jovial ease. "The connection out here by the pool must be dropping. Run it again, Julian, and add another 1,000 to your tip for the inconvenience." Julian kept his face entirely neutral. He reset the terminal and held it out once more. Marcus tapped the heavy black metal card against the glass. Buzz! The red error message flashed again. This time the sound seemed to echo much louder across the silent waiting crowd. The emerald green mistress dropped her hand from Marcus's bicep. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but from my vantage point in the security room, I saw her body language instantly shift from triumphant to cautious. The surrounding guests, previously buzzing with eager anticipation, suddenly fell completely silent. In their ultra-exclusive high society world, a declined black card was not just a technical glitch. It was the equivalent of a fatal, highly contagious disease. Marcus's face began to turn a mottled, ugly shade of red. The effortless charm evaporated, replaced by a rigid, desperate panic. He hastily shoved the black card back into his pocket and pulled out his sleek leather wallet. He extracted a different card, the Platinum corporate account linked directly to his supposedly untouchable investment firm. "Use this one," Marcus ordered, his voice dropping an octave, the forced joviality entirely gone. "And bypass the tap feature. Insert the chip." Julian silently obeyed. He inserted the Platinum card into the bottom of the machine. The terminal processed for 3 agonizing seconds. Then it beeped twice. The red light flashed again. Declined. I sat back in my chair in the security room, a slow, deep breath filling my lungs. The adrenaline rushing through my veins was intoxicating. For 10 years, I had quietly managed the accounts, balancing the ledgers, and moving money from my private holding company to cover his disastrous mistakes. I had artificially inflated his net worth to protect his pride. He genuinely believed that his wealth was an infinite self-replenishing well. He had no idea that I was the one holding the bucket. Down by the pool, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Marcus was sweating. A single drop of perspiration rolled down the side of his perfectly styled hair. He frantically pulled a third card from his wallet, his personal Platinum debit card. He snatched the terminal directly from Julian's hands and aggressively swiped the magnetic strip himself. Declined. The bold red letters illuminated Marcus's horrified face. He stared at the screen as if it were written in a foreign language. The silence of the 200 guests was no longer polite. It was heavy, judgmental, and incredibly suffocating. Whispers began to break out in the back rows. Spencer, who just minutes earlier had thrown a $20 bill at my feet, was staring at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes. Spencer's own failing real estate company was entirely dependent on Marcus's financial backing. If Marcus was broke, Spencer was completely ruined. Chloe stood frozen, her champagne flute trembling in her manicured hand. Before Marcus could even attempt to offer another pathetic, transparent excuse to the crowd, I gave Harrison the final signal. "Cut it," I commanded. Harrison pressed the execution key. In an instant, the lavish, extravagant atmosphere of the pool deck was completely annihilated. The soft ambient string lights strung across the massive oak trees instantly went black. The glowing underwater lights of the infinity pool shut off, turning the water into a dark, ominous abyss. The background music pumping through the hidden outdoor speakers died with a sharp, abrupt pop. The sudden plunge into darkness was met with a chorus of startled screams and gasps from the elite guests. They were completely plunged into the shadows, illuminated only by the flickering, dancing orange flames of the outdoor gas fire pits. The romantic, luxurious 10th anniversary celebration had been instantly transformed into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare. Then the harsh, blinding white emergency security floodlights slammed on. The intense clinical beams bathed the pool deck in an unforgiving interrogate-style glare. It completely stripped away the romantic ambiance, highlighting the panicked, confused faces of Atlanta's most powerful socialites. They looked less like untouchable royalty and more like terrified trespassers caught in a restricted zone. Beatrice could not handle the loss of control. The sudden, humiliating collapse of her flawless event pushed her over the edge into pure, unhinged fury. She stomped down the marble stairs, her red designer gown dragging harshly against the stone. She shoved her way past the frozen guests and marched directly up to Julian, the catering manager. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice screeched, pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger directly in Julian's face. "You incompetent fool. You have completely ruined my son's celebration. Your equipment is clearly broken, and now you have blown the power circuits with your cheap, faulty machinery. I will absolutely destroy your catering company. I will make sure you never work a single high society event in this city ever again. Run the card manually right now." Julian did not flinch. He did not cower or apologize. Through the earpiece securely tucked into his left ear, I knew he was receiving real-time updates directly from Harrison's security feed. He stood his ground, looking down at the furious matriarch with an expression of cold, professional detachment. He slowly raised his head, looking past Beatrice to address Marcus, ensuring his voice carried clearly across the silent, captive audience. "I assure you, madam, my equipment is functioning perfectly." Julian stated, his voice ringing out with devastating clarity in the stark, floodlit courtyard. "The power grid has been restricted by the central security system, and as for the payment, I cannot run the card manually because the terminal is not indicating a technical error." Julian looked down at his tablet, swiping across the screen before locking eyes with a suddenly pale, trembling Marcus. "The bank is not declining the transaction due to insufficient funds, Mr. Blackwell." Julian announced, every single syllable echoing like a gunshot. "The bank is declining the transaction because every single account associated with your name, your mother's name, and your corporate entity has been officially frozen by the primary account holder. You have zero active assets. Your entire financial portfolio has been completely locked." The heavy soundproof door of the security hub isolated me entirely from the chaos I had just unleashed. I sat back comfortably in the premium leather command chair, resting my hands on the cool metal of the control console. The wall of high-definition monitors illuminated the dark room with a stark, bluish glow. The primary camera feed, positioned perfectly above the sweeping marble staircase, zoomed in on the scene unfolding exactly as I had orchestrated it. The instant Harrison executed my command, the lavish, extravagant atmosphere of the pool deck was completely annihilated. The soft, romantic string lights draped across the massive century-old oak trees went black in perfect synchronization. The glowing, ethereal underwater lights of the infinity pool completely shut off, turning the crystal-clear water into a dark, ominous abyss. The upbeat jazz music pumping through the hidden outdoor speakers died with a sharp, abrupt pop. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the 200 wealthy guests. The sudden plunge into the pitch black was met with a chorus of startled screams, the shattering of dropped crystal champagne flutes, and the panicked gasps of Atlanta's most powerful socialites. They were completely terrified. They were people who expected the world to constantly bend to their absolute convenience, and the sudden loss of control paralyzed them. I watched the thermal imaging cameras track their frantic, confused movements as they bumped into each other in the dark. Let them sweat, I thought, sipping a glass of chilled water Harrison had silently placed beside my keyboard. 10 seconds later, the automated emergency protocols triggered, but these were not the soft, accommodating backup lights of a luxury resort. These were the harsh, blinding, industrial-grade security floodlights I had installed specifically for total perimeter lockdown. The intense clinical beams slammed on all at once, bathing the entire pool deck in an unforgiving interrogate-style glare. It completely stripped away the carefully curated romantic ambiance, highlighting the panicked, disoriented faces of the elite attendees. They looked less like untouchable royalty and more like terrified trespassers caught entirely off guard. On the central monitor, the camera tracked Marcus. He was frantically adjusting his custom-tailored tuxedo, his face flushed with extreme embarrassment as he tried to project an aura of control. He immediately signaled for Julian, the head catering manager, aggressively gesturing toward the towering pyramid of imported crystal glasses set up near the main bar. Marcus desperately needed a distraction. He needed to prove to his wealthy peers that this was merely a minor technical glitch and that the Great Blackwell dynasty was still firmly in power. Julian stepped forward, his posture rigid and impeccably professional. He held a silver tray containing the golden mobile payment terminal. The bill for the exclusive, custom-ordered vintage champagne tower was exactly $10,000. It was a completely absurd, frivolous expense that Marcus had insisted upon just to flaunt his supposed wealth to his new 25-year-old mistress, who was currently clutching his arm with wide, frightened eyes. Marcus puffed out his chest, plastering a fake, reassuring smile across his face for the watching crowd. He casually reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew his heavy, solid metal black card. He held it up just long enough for the surrounding guests to admire the ultimate symbol of unlimited, unrestricted credit, before confidently inserting it into the bottom of Julian's payment terminal. I leaned closer to the monitor. I did not blink. Down on the pool deck, the terminal emitted a sharp, loud, discordant buzz. A bright red error bar flashed forcefully across Julian's digital screen. Marcus's victorious smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting nervously toward the machine. He quickly cleared his throat, attempting to brush off the deeply humiliating sound. He aggressively snatched the terminal from Julian's hands, pulled out his sleek leather wallet, and extracted a second card. This one was the Platinum corporate account linked directly to his investment firm. He swiped the magnetic strip with unnecessary force. The machine buzzed again. The bold red letters illuminated Marcus's horrified face. Declined. A single drop of perspiration rolled down the side of his perfectly styled hair. The silence of the 200 guests was no longer polite or confused. It was heavy, judgmental, and incredibly suffocating. The elite members of high society could forgive a power outage, but a declined credit card was an absolute, unforgivable sin. Marcus frantically pulled a third card from his wallet, his personal platinum debit card. His hands were visibly shaking as he tapped the chip against the glass screen. Declined. The young woman in the emerald green dress dropped Marcus's arm entirely, taking 2 large immediate steps backward. In her shallow, opportunistic world, a frozen bank account was highly contagious, and she had absolutely no intention of sinking with his ship. Beatrice could not handle the rapidly deteriorating situation. The sudden, humiliating collapse of her flawless event pushed her entirely over the edge into pure, unhinged fury. She stomped across the marble deck, her red designer gown dragging harshly against the stone. She shoved her way past the frozen guests and marched directly up to Julian, pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger directly in his face. "What is the absolute meaning of this?" Beatrice screeched, her voice echoing shrilly in the stark, floodlit courtyard. "You incompetent fool! You have completely ruined my son's celebration. Your equipment is clearly broken. I will personally guarantee that your catering company is destroyed. I will make sure you never work a single high society event in this entire state ever again. Process the charge immediately. Julian did not flinch. He did not cower or apologize. Through the earpiece securely tucked into his left ear, he was receiving real-time updates directly from Harrison's security feed. Julian stood his ground, looking down at the furious matriarch with an expression of cold, unyielding professional detachment. "I assure you, madam, my equipment is functioning perfectly," Julian stated, his voice ringing out with devastating clarity. "The bank is not declining the transaction due to insufficient funds or a technical error. The bank is declining the transaction because every single account associated with the Blackwell family has been officially frozen. Your entire financial portfolio has been completely locked by the primary account holder." The polite, stifled whispers of the crowd instantly transformed into loud, openly scandalized gasps. The social execution was happening in glorious real time. People were discreetly pulling out their smartphones, documenting the incredible implosion of the Blackwell dynasty. The tension escalated to a breaking point. Spencer Marcus's arrogant brother-in-law violently pushed his way through the murmuring crowd. He saw an immediate opportunity to play the hero, to assert his dominance and prove that his real estate wealth could salvage the family's honor. He adjusted his bespoke suit and pulled out his own shiny corporate card, tossing it onto Julian's silver tray with a loud metallic clatter. "Run my card," Spencer commanded loudly, ensuring every single guest could hear his magnanimous rescue. "I will cover my brother-in-law's temporary glitch. We cannot let a minor banking error ruin a beautiful evening." Spencer offered a smug, self-satisfied smile to the crowd. He genuinely believed he was cementing his status as the ultimate savior. He had absolutely no idea that his entire commercial development firm had been quietly bailed out and absorbed by my anonymous holding trust just last month. I owned his debt. I owned his company. I owned his future. Julian picked up Spencer's corporate card and inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine processed the request for 3 agonizing seconds. The guests held their collective breath. The terminal emitted a sharp, blaring buzz that was louder and far more aggressive than before. Julian looked at the screen, his eyebrows raising slightly before he slowly met Spencer's arrogant gaze. "I cannot process this card, sir," Julian announced. "The terminal has permanently locked the card and initiated a severe security block. The specific error code indicates that this corporate account has been frozen pending a federal investigation for suspected money laundering." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. The high society guests of Atlanta physically recoiled, stepping away from Spencer as if he were holding a live explosive. Federal investigations were the ultimate poison. Spencer's face drained of all color, shifting from a confident flush to a sickly pale gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. Chloe covered her face with her hands, backing away into the shadows as she realized her limitless credit lines were entirely gone. Marcus was in a state of pure, unfiltered panic. He ripped his sleek smartphone from his tuxedo pocket. His fingers were trembling so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He bypassed his regular contacts and dialed the direct emergency line to his elite private banker. In his frantic, desperate state, he aggressively tapped the speakerphone button. The ringing tone echoed loudly in the tense, silent air for everyone to hear. "Blackwell Wealth Management. This is Richard." A crisp, professional voice answered through the phone's speaker. "Richard it is, Marcus," he yelled into the device, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his dignified facade. "What the hell is going on with my accounts? Every single card is declining. My mother's accounts are locked. Spencer's corporate cards are flagged. Fix this immediately before I sue your entire institution into the ground." There was a heavy, incredibly uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. The sound of rapid typing could be heard through the speaker. "Mr. Blackwell," Richard said, his tone lacking the usual sycophantic warmth he always reserved for his wealthiest clients. "I am looking at the master portfolio right now. I cannot authorize any overrides. I cannot restore your access. What do you mean you cannot restore access? Marcus screamed, a vein bulging visibly on his forehead as he paced back and forth on the marble deck. I am the managing director of these funds. I demand that you lift the freeze right now. You are not the managing director, Sir Richard stated flatly, his words acting like a physical blow to Marcus's chest. You are merely an authorized user on a subsidiary account. The primary account holder, the sole legal owner of the master trust that funds your entire portfolio, contacted us 20 minutes ago. The primary account holder has officially revoked all your access rights and frozen every single asset across the entire network. Marcus stared at the phone in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. His entire reality was fracturing into a million unrecoverable pieces. The primary account holder, he stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Who holds the master account? The founder and sole beneficiary of the holding company is your wife, Maya Blackwell, Richard replied calmly. You currently possess 0 active assets. Have a good evening, Mr. Blackwell. The line went dead. A dial tone echoed across the dark flood-lit pool deck, broadcasting Marcus's absolute ruin to the entire city's elite. Marcus dropped the phone. It shattered against the hard marble floor, the cracked glass perfectly mirroring his completely destroyed existence. Beatrice sank to her knees, grasping her chest, as the full crushing weight of their financial annihilation paralyzed her. They had nothing. The mansion, the cars, the status, the entire towering facade of their superior existence was funded, owned, and controlled entirely by the woman they had just thrown out like common trash. Inside the secure climate-controlled hub, I watched their spectacular devastation on the high-definition monitors. The satisfaction was profound, absolute, and deeply intoxicating. I leaned forward in my leather command chair and reached for the silver microphone connected directly to the estate's massive high-fidelity public address system. I pressed the broadcast button and my voice suddenly boomed through the hidden speakers, echoing powerfully across the entire compound. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and especially good evening, Marcus. My voice radiated from the hidden high-fidelity surround sound speakers buried within the stonework, the trees, and the architecture of the mansion. The acoustic power of the system was absolute, making it sound as though I were speaking directly into the ear of every single person standing on the marble pool deck. The 200 guests collectively gasped their heads, darting around in frantic confusion, trying to locate the source of the disembodied voice. Down below, Marcus froze entirely. The shattered pieces of his smartphone lay scattered at his feet. His face, previously twisted in a mask of arrogant rage, was now completely drained of blood. Please do not adjust your evening wear. I continued my tone perfectly, even projecting a chilling, unshakable calm. I know this is a slight deviation from the carefully curated schedule my mother-in-law provided. You were all expecting a glorious, triumphant toast to Marcus's brilliant future. You were expecting to watch the lowly, uneducated working-class wife slink away into the shadows so the great Blackwell dynasty could finally upgrade its social portfolio. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence wrap around the terrified crowd. The harsh emergency floodlights illuminated them perfectly, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported stone. Let us talk about that brilliant future, I said, my voice echoing over the still black water of the infinity pool. Let us direct our attention to the lovely young woman in the emerald green gown. Yes, you. The one who just took 3 massive steps away from my husband. Every single pair of eyes in the courtyard instantly snapped toward the young mistress. She shrank under the intense, judgmental spotlight, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she could physically shield herself from the sudden exposure. That is a stunning diamond tennis bracelet you are wearing, I announced to the captive audience. $75,000 purchased exactly 21 days ago from the exclusive boutique in Buckhead Village. And if you ask Marcus to empty his left inner jacket pocket right now, you will find a velvet box containing a flawless 3-carat princess-cut diamond ring. He was planning a spectacular public proposal tonight, right after he finished discarding his terrible, unrefined wife. A loud wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the elite crowd. Several prominent socialites covered their mouths in disbelief. The mistress stared at Marcus, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer greed, clearly unaware that she was the intended recipient of such an extravagant ring tonight. Marcus frantically clamped his hand over his left pocket, inadvertently confirming to the entire city that I was telling the absolute truth. But there is a very fascinating mathematical problem here, I continued, my voice sharp and cutting. As Julian, the catering manager, just so helpfully revealed, my husband does not actually have a dime to his name. His personal accounts are empty. His corporate accounts are frozen. The grand, impressive wealth he has been actively flaunting to all of you tonight is a complete and total fabrication. So how exactly does a broke, failing finance director afford a $100,000 engagement package for his brand new mistress? I let the question hang in the humid Georgia air. I watched the live camera feed as Marcus's eyes darted wildly toward the back doors of the mansion, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. He knew exactly what I was about to say. He knew I had found the buried bodies. Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping to a colder, more dangerous register. Beatrice flinched violently. She was still on her knees near the edge of the pool, clutching her chest, looking like a deflated, pathetic version of the powerful matriarch she pretended to be just moments ago. She slowly looked up toward the unblinking security cameras mounted under the eaves of the roof. I highly recommend you log into your private offshore retirement trust, I instructed her. The massive untouchable fund your late husband left exclusively for your care. The exact same fund you tasked your brilliant, trustworthy son to manage 3 years ago because you believed I was too uneducated to understand complex financial instruments. Beatrice stopped breathing. She slowly turned her head, her gaze locking onto her son. Marcus could not meet his mother's eyes. He stared at the marble floor, his entire body trembling. He did not buy those diamonds with his own money, Beatrice Y revealed, delivering the final, fatal strike. He bought them with your money. I spent the last 72 hours conducting a full forensic audit of the family ledgers. Your son has spent the last 3 years systematically embezzling millions of dollars from your private accounts. He routed your retirement funds through a dozen untraceable shell companies in the Caymans, bleeding your accounts completely dry to fund his secret life, his bad investments, and his new teenage girlfriend. He did not just betray me tonight. He robbed you entirely blind. A visceral, agonizing shriek tore through the courtyard. It did not come from the guests. It came from Beatrice, the woman who had spent a decade tormenting me, who had proudly thrown a dirty cleaning apron at my feet and called me a permanent stain on her legacy, was now looking at her golden child with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "You stole from me!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she scrambled to her feet. She lunged toward Marcus, her hands balled into tight fists. "You stole your own father's money. You told me the market was fluctuating. You told me the assets were tied up in long-term bonds. Mother, please, she is lying." Marcus stammered frantically, backing away from the furious woman. "She is a vindictive, crazy woman trying to destroy us. Do not listen to her. The money is safe. It is all safe." "He is lying to you right now," I stated flatly over the speakers, immediately cutting off his pathetic defense. "Look at his face, Beatrice. Look at the coward hiding behind the suit I paid for. Your accounts hold a balance of exactly $0.00. You are completely, undeniably bankrupt." Beatrice slapped her son across the face. The sharp, violent smack echoed loudly across the silent pool deck. Marcus stumbled backward, clutching his cheek in absolute shock. The wealthy guests of Atlanta watched in stunned, morbid fascination as the legendary, untouchable Blackwell family tore itself to pieces in front of their very eyes. The mistress in the emerald dress took one look at the violent Broke family and immediately turned on her heel, power-walking rapidly toward the locked side gates, desperately trying to abandon the sinking ship. Marcus completely snapped. The public humiliation, the physical strike from his mother, and the total exposure of his criminal activities broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. He threw his head back and screamed at the security cameras mounted on the walls. "Call the police!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with manic desperation. "Someone call the police right now." She hacked the system. She is a cyber terrorist. She locked us in here and she is manipulating the banking software. He spun around, grabbing Spencer by the lapels of his expensive suit. Spencer looked like he was about to vomit his own money-laundering crimes hovering dangerously over his head. "Get Harrison," Marcus ordered his terrified brother-in-law. "Get the chief of security. We need to call the property management firm. We need to call the holding company that legally owns this estate. Tell them a hacker has breached the mainframe. Tell them the real owner of this land needs to come down here and arrest this crazy woman for trespassing and corporate espionage. I want her in federal prison tonight." Marcus was hyperventilating, spit flying from his lips as he screamed into the night sky, begging for the invisible landlord to swoop in and save his pathetic kingdom. He was demanding that the supreme authority of the estate come forward and execute justice. Inside the central security hub, I took my finger off the microphone button. The broadcast ended, leaving the courtyard in a tense, ringing silence, punctuated only by Marcus's heavy, panicked breathing and Beatrice's quiet, devastating sobs. I stood up from the leather command chair. I smoothed down the front of my black silk dress, feeling a surge of pure electric power course through my veins. I looked at Harrison, who was standing at attention by the reinforced steel door. "He wants to meet the real owner of the estate," I said quietly. Harrison offered a sharp, deeply respectful nod. He tapped his earpiece, communicating directly with his tactical units. "All units form up on the primary terrace doors. The director is making her exit." I walked out of the security hub and moved swiftly down the restricted, dimly lit corridor. I did not rush. I walked with absolute, uncompromising authority. I reached the grand foyer where the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors separated the opulent interior of the mansion from the outdoor pool deck. Through the glass, I could see the backs of the 200 guests, all staring at Marcus as he continued his manic, desperate ranting. Harrison flanked my right side. 6 heavily armed elite private security contractors materialized from the shadows of the mansion, flanking my left and taking up positions directly behind me. They wore immaculate black tactical gear, their presence projecting an overwhelming, lethal level of professional force. They were not there to protect Marcus. They were there to protect their boss. "Open them," I commanded. Harrison reached forward and gripped the heavy brass handles of the primary terrace doors. He pulled them open with a loud mechanical scrape that immediately caught the attention of the crowd outside. The wealthy guests turned their heads toward the mansion. The crowd instantly parted, creating a wide, clear path leading directly from the glass doors to the marble steps where Marcus and Beatrice stood. I stepped out into the harsh, glaring white light of the security floodlights, flanked by a wall of armed guards, ready to introduce my husband to his worst nightmare. The cold night air hit my face the second I crossed the threshold, a sharp contrast to the burning heat of the floodlights now dominating the courtyard. I moved down the grand, sweeping staircase with slow, deliberate precision. The rhythmic, heavy thud of my security detail's combat boots striking the marble steps echoed like a war drum across the paralyzed crowd. Harrison flanked my right, his hand resting casually near his radio earpiece, while the other heavily armed contractors formed an impenetrable moving wall of black tactical gear around me. The 200 elite guests, who just an hour ago had been eagerly whispering about my pathetic departure, now parted frantically to make way. Women in designer gowns stumbled over each other, spilling expensive wine on the stone tiles in their desperation to clear a path. Men who prided themselves on their absolute power in the boardroom physically shrank back, pressing themselves against the decorative pillars to avoid making eye contact with the men guarding me. They were witnessing a complete violent shift in the social hierarchy, and they were terrified. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead. Marcus was standing at the base of the champagne display, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. The arrogant, untouchable finance god was gone, replaced by a trembling, sweating fraud who was finally being forced to look at the architect of his entire existence. Before I could reach the center of the patio, a flash of bright red darted through the frozen crowd. Beatrice had lost whatever fragments of her mind she still possessed. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her financial ruin had completely short-circuited her aristocratic restraint. She lunged forward, bursting out from the crowd with a visceral scream of pure rage. Her face was twisted into a hideous mask of hatred. Her hands curled into claws as she charged directly toward me. "You classless, ungrateful piece of trash!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking violently. "I will kill you for this. I will destroy you." She raised her hand, aiming a vicious, open-palmed slap directly at my face. I did not flinch. I did not even break my stride. Before Beatrice's hand could come anywhere near me, one of my guards stepped smoothly into her path. With effortless, practiced precision, he raised his forearm, intercepting her wrist mid-swing. The sound of her arm colliding with his Kevlar-reinforced bracer was a dull, heavy thud. He did not hurt her, but he applied just enough calculated force to completely arrest her momentum. With a swift, dismissive motion, he shoved her wrist backward. Beatrice lost her footing on the slick marble. She stumbled backward, her expensive heels sliding out from under her, and she collapsed hard onto the stone deck. Her designer dress tangled around her legs, exposing her absolute lack of dignity to the entire social circle she had spent her life trying to impress. "Madam, I strongly advise you to remain seated," the guard stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried no emotion whatsoever. I stopped walking and looked down at my mother-in-law. She was gasping for air on the ground, clutching her wrist, looking up at me with eyes wide with terror and incomprehension. For a decade, she had treated me like a parasite, a working-class burden that had infected her pristine bloodline. Now she was literally sitting in the dirt at my feet, held at bay by men I paid to tolerate her presence. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the most liberating sensation I had ever experienced. I stepped past her, leaving her hyperventilating on the ground, and walked directly up to the main display table where Marcus was standing. The young mistress in the emerald green dress had already retreated to the far edge of the pool, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. Marcus looked as though he might physically vomit. He was shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the glass table to keep himself upright. "Maya, please, Marcus," whispered, his voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. "Please stop this. We can talk about this inside. We can fix this quietly. Do not do this in front of everyone." I reached into the leather tote bag Harrison was holding beside me. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal portfolio bound in black leather with a gold crest embossed on the front. It was the physical manifestation of 10 years of silent, calculating endurance. "You love this house, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent, breathless courtyard. "You loved showing it off. You loved bringing your investors here, walking them through the grand halls, pointing out the imported Italian marble and the custom architecture. You loved telling them that this estate was the ultimate symbol of the Blackwell legacy, a monument to your incredible self-made financial genius." I raised the heavy leather portfolio and slammed it down onto the glass table. The sharp cracking sound made several guests physically jump. "Open it," I commanded. Marcus stared at the portfolio as if it were a bomb. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the heavy leather cover. Inside sat a pristine notarized stack of legal documents. At the very top was the master deed to the 10-acre estate, the surrounding land, and the private access roads. "Read the name of the legal owner, Marcus. Read it out loud so your friends can hear exactly whose grass they are standing on." He stared down at the paper. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet night air. His eyes scanned the bold black ink at the bottom of the page. "It is a trust," Marcus whispered, a tear of absolute humiliation spilling over his lower eyelid. "It belongs to the Vanguard Apex Trust." "And who is the sole director and exclusive beneficiary of the Vanguard Apex Trust?" I asked, leaning slightly forward, invading his personal space. Marcus closed his eyes. The last remaining shred of his ego completely evaporated. "You," he choked out. "It is you." "I own the walls you sleep inside," I announced to the crowd, my voice sharp and cutting. "I own the ground you are standing on. I own the cars parked in the garage. I own the clothes on your back." For a decade, I allowed you to play the king of the castle because it was easier to let you have the illusion of power than to deal with your fragile, pathetic insecurities. But an illusion is all it ever was. You are nothing but an overpaid tenant who just violated his lease. Spencer, who had been hiding near the outdoor bar since his own corporate card was publicly declined, suddenly stepped forward. His face was a mask of desperate, aggressive bravado. He was trying to salvage the situation, trying to prove that the men in this family still held some leverage. "You think you are so smart?" Maya Spencer sneered, his voice loud and artificially confident. "You think you can just freeze a few bank accounts and take a house, and that makes you untouchable. You are completely delusional." Marcus and I are deeply embedded in the commercial real estate sector. We have institutional backing. We partner with the biggest property management conglomerates on the East Coast. My firm just signed a massive exclusive $50 million partnership contract last week. We will rebuild our liquid assets in a month, and then we will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable life. You cannot touch our corporate infrastructure. I slowly turned my head to look at Spencer. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of the man was almost comical. He was standing on the absolute edge of a cliff, blindfolded, bragging about his ability to fly. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a cold sound that made Spencer's forced smile falter. "Your new partnership contract," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "The massive $50 million commercial development deal that you and Marcus have been bragging about to every politician and banker in this city for the last 6 months. The deal that was supposed to save your failing firm and catapult Marcus into the billionaire tier." Spencer puffed out his chest, though his eyes darted nervously toward my security guards. "Yes, that exact deal. We are partnered with absolute titans. We are backed by Apex Global Management. They are the biggest player in the state. They have resources you cannot even begin to comprehend." I nodded slowly, letting him dig his own grave as deeply as possible. Apex Global Management is indeed a very powerful, very ruthless corporate entity. I agreed. They completely absorb weak, failing real estate firms. They strip them of their valuable assets, fire their incompetent executive boards, and liquidate the useless remnants. They are absolute predators in the commercial sector. Exactly, Spencer shot back, entirely missing the point. And we are their primary regional partners. "You are not their partners, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register. "You are their prey." I reached into the black leather portfolio on the table and extracted a second stack of documents. These were the corporate filings, the heavily guarded structural blueprints of a massive financial empire. I held them up for Spencer to see. "When you signed that exclusive partnership contract last week, you did not just agree to a joint venture," I explained, breaking down the reality with surgical precision. "You signed a binding, irrevocable clause that allowed Apex Global Management to acquire a controlling 51% interest in your firm in the event of a severe financial default. You literally used your own company as collateral because you were so desperate for the cash injection." Spencer's face went completely slack. The realization was beginning to dawn on him, slow and incredibly horrifying. "And tonight," I continued, "because Marcus's accounts have all frozen, and because your firm is completely dependent on Marcus's financial backing. Your company is officially in severe financial default. The clause has been triggered automatically. Apex Global Management just took full legal hostile control of your entire corporate enterprise. You do not own a company anymore, Spencer. You are just a liability on a spreadsheet." "You cannot know that," Spencer stammered, his voice rising in panic as he looked desperately at the surrounding guests. "You have no idea how Apex Global operates. You are just a housewife. You have no access to their internal maneuvers." I took one final step toward him. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. "I know exactly how Apex Global Management operates, Spencer," I said, every word dripping with absolute authority. "Because I am the one who wrote their operating protocols. I am the one who structured their aggressive acquisition strategies. I am the one who approved the targeted takeover of your pathetic, failing firm." Spencer stopped breathing. His jaw went slack. I did not just hack a bank account tonight, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the very back rows of the terrified elite. I am the founder, the primary shareholder, and the absolute sovereign owner of Apex Global Management. I am the titan you have been bragging about. I am the predator that just swallowed your entire future whole. You thought you were partnering with a faceless conglomerate to save yourselves. You were actually just walking blindly into a trap that I spent 3 years building specifically for you. Beatrice suddenly shattered the stunned silence of the courtyard. She scrambled up from the marble deck, her movements frantic and entirely stripped of her usual aristocratic grace. Her face was contorted into an ugly, desperate sneer as she pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Do not listen to a single word this psychotic woman says!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the dark, quiet pool. "She is a fraud. She is a manipulative, penniless gold digger who clawed her way into our family. She does not own Apex Global. She does not own anything. She comes from absolutely nothing. You are slandering my son to hide your own pathetic jealousy." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The microphone amplified my calm, devastatingly even tone across the entire estate. "From nothing, Beatrice?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Your memory is as entirely fabricated as your precious social standing." I took a slow step forward. The wall of black-clad security contractors moved flawlessly with me, an intimidating wave of force that made the front row of wealthy guests involuntarily step backward. "Let us rewind the clock exactly 3 years," I said, making sure to project my voice clearly to the 200 captive socialites. "Do you all remember the autumn of 2023? The sudden, mysterious season where Beatrice Blackwell completely stopped hosting her lavish charity galas? You told your country club friends you were extensively remodeling the ballroom. But the actual truth was that you could not even afford the basic catering deposit." Marcus flinched violently. He raised both hands, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Maya, shut your mouth. Do not do this. I am begging you." I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice's pale, trembling face. "3 years ago, your brilliant son made a series of catastrophic, highly illegal leveraged trades," I announced, pulling the invisible skeletons directly out of the family closet. The federal regulators were actively circling his firm. The creditors had already drafted the foreclosure papers for this very estate. The great Blackwell family was exactly 72 hours away from federal indictment's total asset seizure and absolute humiliating bankruptcy. "Lies," Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking. "My son navigated that market correction brilliantly. He secured private venture capital. He saved this family with his own financial genius. There was no venture capital." Beatrice, I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that offered zero comfort. "No legitimate bank on the East Coast would touch your toxic assets. I was the venture capital." The courtyard went entirely dead. The elite guests who had spent the last decade looking down their noses at my working-class background were now staring at me with expressions of pure shock. When my grandmother passed away, I explained the truth, finally stepping out into the blinding security floodlights. She left me a massive, entirely untraceable portfolio of early-stage tech investments and sovereign bonds. It was a portfolio I intentionally never disclosed to my new husband, because I knew exactly how greedy and entitled this family truly was. But when I came home one evening and found Marcus sobbing uncontrollably on the master bathroom floor, terrified of going to federal prison, I made the worst mistake of my entire life. I played the role of the loyal, supportive wife. I turned my gaze to Marcus. He was staring at his shoes, his chest heaving, tears of absolute shame dripping silently onto the marble floor. "I quietly liquidated $40 million of my own private inheritance," I stated, driving the final nail into their coffin. "I funneled that money through an anonymous offshore trust to cover your massive corporate debts, settle your aggressive margin calls, and pay off your impending federal fines. I bought your freedom, Marcus. I saved you from a concrete cell. And I bought your dignity, Beatrice. I paid to keep your precious reputation entirely intact." The guests began whispering furiously among themselves. The elite circle of Atlanta was vicious, and blood was officially in the water. They were looking at Marcus with absolute disgust. He was not a financial titan. He was a corporate beggar, surviving entirely on his wife's secret charity. "And how exactly did you repay me?" I asked, my voice ringing with cold, hard justice. "You took the credit. You strutted right back into your boardroom, puffed out your chest, and claimed you had orchestrated a miraculous financial recovery. You allowed your mother to continue treating me like a worthless, uneducated burden. You stood by and watched her humiliate me at every single family dinner, all while you were secretly surviving on my dead grandmother's dime. You despised me because I was the living, breathing reminder that you are a complete, utter failure." Beatrice was hyperventilating. She grabbed the edge of a tall cocktail table to keep from collapsing again. "No," she gasped, shaking her head in violent denial. "No, that is impossible. You are a nobody. You are trash." "Which brings us directly to the present," I said, shifting my focus entirely to my mother-in-law. I raised my hand and pointed directly at Beatrice's chest. "That exquisite piece of jewelry around your neck," I noted. "The 20-carat cascading diamond collar. You tell everyone in your country club that it is a priceless Blackwell family heirloom passed down directly from your great-grandmother." Beatrice instinctively brought her trembling hands up to her throat, clutching the glittering diamonds defensively. "It is," she cried out. "It belongs to my family. You cannot touch this. Your family pawned the original diamond collar 50 years ago to cover a massive gambling debt," I revealed loudly, destroying her final shred of aristocratic pride. "I bought that exact replica at a private Sotheby's auction 2 years ago. I purchased it using my Apex Global corporate expense account, just to ensure you would not look like a pathetic pauper at the winter gala." Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. "You do not own that necklace, Beatrice," I stated, my tone dropping to a frozen, absolute command. "It is registered corporate property belonging to my firm. And as of tonight, your employment as the Great Blackwell matriarch is officially terminated." I did not wait for her to process the devastation. I turned my head slightly to the right, looking at the massive, heavily armed former federal agent standing stoically at my side. "Harrison," I commanded, the words slicing through the humid night air like a blade. "Retrieve my property." Spencer collapsed against the outdoor bar, the blood completely draining from his face. He stared at me with wide, hollow eyes, finally grasping the terrifying reality that his entire corporate existence had just been eradicated by a woman he had spent years mocking as a trophy wife. The silence on the patio was deafening. Even the cicadas in the surrounding trees seemed to have stopped buzzing. I turned my attention back to Marcus. For a moment, he just stood there staring at the thick leather portfolio on the glass table. Then something shifted in his posture. The manic, hyperventilating terror began to recede, replaced by a dark, calculating glint in his eye. He slowly stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his ruined suit. He let out a low, breathy chuckle that gradually grew into a full, arrogant laugh. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "You really think you have won, Maya Marcus?" said his voice, regaining its familiar condescending tone. "You think you are a genius because you hid a few $1 billion in an offshore account? You think you can just orchestrate this massive theatrical reveal and walk away leaving me with nothing? You are forgetting one minor, incredibly important legal detail. We live in a community property state." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The wealthy socialites and corporate lawyers in attendance immediately understood what he was implying. Beatrice, who was still clutching her wrist on the ground, suddenly looked up, a glimmer of desperate, greedy hope returning to her eyes. Marcus took a confident step forward, his chest puffed out, emboldened by his own perceived cleverness. "We have been legally married for a decade, Maya. I do not care if you secretly own Apex Global Management. I do not care if you control the trust that owns this estate. Every single asset, every single stock option, every single dollar you generated during the duration of our marriage is a joint marital asset. You did not just build an empire for yourself. You built an empire for us. He walked over to the glass table and slammed his hand down on the portfolio. I am going to divorce you, Maya. I am going to hire the most vicious, bloodthirsty litigators on the eastern seaboard, and I am going to drag you through a public, agonizing legal battle. I am going to subpoena every single ledger of Apex Global. The courts will freeze all of it, and when the dust settles, the judge is going to award me exactly 50% of everything you own. You thought you were leaving me bankrupt. You actually just made me a billionaire. I stood perfectly still, letting his triumphant, greedy rant echo into the night. I watched his face flush with victory. He actually believed it. He actually thought his legal prowess was going to save him from his own incompetence. I looked at Harrison, who was standing beside me with a look of pure stoic amusement. I gave him a single subtle nod. Harrison reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a slim black folder. He stepped forward and placed it directly on top of Marcus's hand, pinning it to the glass table. You are absolutely right about community property laws, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through his arrogance like ice. They are designed to protect spouses from financial disparity. However, they only apply to assets that are not explicitly protected by an independent, irrevocable trust established prior to the date of the marriage. Marcus frowned, pulling his hand out from under the folder. What are you talking about? You inherited that money 3 years ago. We were already married for 7 years by then. I inherited the remaining balance of the estate 3 years ago. I corrected him, my tone clinical and precise. But my grandmother established the Vanguard Apex Trust 15 years ago, long before I ever met you. She named me the sole beneficiary and the absolute director upon my 25th birthday. Every single corporate entity, including Apex Global Management, was seated and structured under the protective umbrella of that pre-existing trust. It is completely insulated from our marriage. It always has been. Marcus shook his head, a nervous tick returning to his jaw. No. Any income generated during the marriage, even from a separate trust, can be contested. My lawyers will tear that apart. You commingled funds. You paid off my debts with that money. That makes it marital property. You messed up Maya. I gestured toward the black folder Harrison had just placed on the table. Open it, Marcus. He stared at the folder, hesitating. I did not give him the luxury of time. Let me refresh your memory, I said, my voice echoing loudly across the patio. 5 years ago, you were preparing for a massive corporate retreat in Aspen. You were running late. You were frantically packing your golf clubs and yelling at me because your shirts were not pressed correctly. Do you remember that morning? Marcus slowly opened the folder. His eyes dropped to the single heavy document inside, adorned with multiple blue notary seals. I walked into your home office with a stack of 50 pages. I continued painting the picture for the entire audience. I told you it was a stack of routine end-of-year tax disclosures and corporate liability waivers required by our accountant. You were so annoyed that I was bothering you. You told me I was useless with paperwork. You grabbed your expensive fountain pen and you furiously signed the bottom of every single page without reading a single word, just so you could get out the door and meet your mistress on the ski slopes. Marcus went entirely still. He stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was his signature, bold, aggressive, and undeniably authentic. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. Page 42 of that stack was not a tax disclosure, Marcus. It was a comprehensive, ironclad post-nuptial agreement. A complete, unconditional waiver of rights. You legally relinquished any and all claims to the Vanguard Apex Trust, to Apex Global Management, to this estate, and to any future income generated by those entities. You explicitly agreed that in the event of a divorce, you would walk away with absolutely nothing but the assets solely registered in your individual name. The heavy, crushing reality of his situation finally broke him. Marcus's knees gave out. He collapsed into the patio chair behind him, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. The legal document slipped from his trembling fingers and fluttered onto the marble floor. I watched the last spark of life leave his eyes. You do not get 50%, Marcus. You do not get 50 cents. You signed away your entire future because you were too arrogant to read the paperwork your uneducated wife put in front of you. Marcus sat paralyzed in the patio chair, his mouth hanging open as his brain violently rejected the reality of the document lying by his feet. He stared at the post-nuptial agreement, his own arrogant, careless signature mocking him from the pristine white paper. The profound, suffocating silence of the courtyard was broken only by the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing. The 200 elite guests remained absolutely frozen, holding their breath collectively, witnessing the total annihilation of a man they had all revered just an hour prior. I looked down at him, feeling a deep, resonating sense of peace replacing the anger I had carried for a decade. You built your entire life on the assumption that you were the smartest person in every room, Marcus. You assumed I was just a naive, uneducated girl who was lucky to be permitted in your presence. You never bothered to read the legal documents I handed you because you genuinely believed my brain was incapable of understanding anything beyond picking out flower arrangements and planning your dinner menus. Your spectacular ego is the exact weapon I used to destroy you. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, digging his fingers into his hair. A low, pathetic sound escaped his throat, a mixture of a sob and a groan. He was entirely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his leverage. But my task tonight was not just about securing my assets or protecting my grandmother's legacy. It was about exposing the absolute rotten core of the man who had tormented me. I needed to ensure that no bank, no investor, and no individual in this city would ever trust him again. I turned away from his broken form and looked up at the massive high-definition projector screen mounted on the stone wall above the outdoor bar. It was the screen Beatrice had rented specifically to showcase a slideshow of Marcus's philanthropic achievements tonight. It was meant to be the glowing centerpiece of his fake legacy. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers once. Harrison immediately tapped his radio earpiece. The massive screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright blue glow over the faces of the terrified guests. Instead of flattering photographs of Marcus cutting ribbons at charity events, the screen displayed a dense, complex matrix of financial ledgers. Red highlights illuminated specific rows of data, drawing every eye in the courtyard directly to the staggering numbers. "You see, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the surround sound speakers. "When I began my forensic audit of your accounts, I expected to find the usual corporate waste. I expected to find the money you siphoned from your mother's retirement fund to pay for your luxury cars and your tailored suits. But what I actually found was a level of desperation that genuinely surprised me." I pointed up at the screen. The guests craned their necks, their eyes widening as they read the detailed bankrouting information displayed in massive, undeniable font. "When your mother's accounts finally ran dry 6 months ago, you realized you had a massive problem," I explained to the captivated audience. "You still had to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. You still had to pay for the private jet charters, the exclusive country club fees, and the outrageously expensive gifts you were using to keep your new mistress entertained. So you decided to cross the one line that no financial director can ever cross. You started stealing directly from the corporate escrow accounts of your own firm." Spencer, who was still leaning against the bar, let out a loud, strangled gasp. He turned to look at the screen, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. "You stole from the firm," Spencer yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Marcus, those are client escrow funds. Those are federally protected accounts." I ignored Spencer and kept my focus entirely on Marcus, who had curled into a tight ball in his chair, refusing to look at the glowing evidence above him. "Between March and November of this year, you executed 17 unauthorized wire transfers," I stated, reading the exact dates and figures flashing on the screen. "You routed the money through 3 different dummy corporations registered in Delaware, attempting to wash the funds before sending them offshore. The total amount embezzled directly from your clients was exactly $5 million. A wave of horrified murmurs swept through the crowd. Several prominent investors who actually had money tied up in Marcus's firm began pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their own attorneys and bankers. The social ruin was complete, but the criminal exposure was just beginning. "But here is the most fascinating part of your little embezzlement scheme, Marcus," I continued, my tone deceptively light. You did not put that stolen $5 million into an account with your own name on it. You knew the regulators were already sniffing around your firm. You knew your personal accounts were compromised. You needed a safe, untraceable place to hide the stolen cash until you could finalize our divorce and secure your payout. I nodded at Harrison. The image on the massive screen shifted instantly. The complex ledgers disappeared, replaced by a single crystal-clear photograph of a banking document from the Cayman Islands. The account balance displayed a staggering $5 million. And directly above the balance, highlighted in bright yellow, was the name of the sole account holder. Every single head in the courtyard turned simultaneously. The spotlight on the patio swung with violent speed, illuminating the far corner of the pool deck. The young mistress in the emerald green dress was standing frozen by the decorative planters. The harsh light caught the terrified, wide-eyed expression on her perfectly contoured face. She looked up at the massive screen, reading her own full legal name, displayed next to a stolen fortune. "You did not just buy her a $75,000 tennis bracelet?" I said, my voice echoing coldly across the water. "You made her the sole signatory on a Cayman Islands account holding $5 million of stolen federal escrow funds. You turned your shiny new girlfriend into the primary accessory for a massive corporate fraud operation." The mistress dropped her champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the stone deck, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the silent courtyard. The realization of what Marcus had actually done to her crashed over her in a visceral wave. She was not the pampered future wife of a billionaire. She was the fall guy. She was the designated target holding the bag of stolen money. She let out a high, panicked sob. Without a single word, she spun around her emerald gown, twisting around her legs, and sprinted frantically toward the heavy wrought iron side gates leading to the driveway. She was operating on pure blind adrenaline, desperately trying to physically run away from the nightmare playing out on the screen. She did not make it 5 steps. From the deep shadows near the garden wall, 2 of my elite security contractors stepped smoothly into her path. They did not draw their weapons. They did not even raise their hands. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an absolute immovable wall of black tactical armor. The mistress slammed hard into the chest of the nearest guard. The impact sent her flying backward. She crashed onto the perfectly manicured grass, her designer dress tearing at the seam. She scrambled backward, kicking off her high heels, her chest heaving as she looked up at the emotionless faces of the men towering over her. "I strongly advise you to stay exactly where you are." I projected over the speakers, my voice stripping away any remaining hope she had of escaping. "Running will only make you look more guilty when the authorities ask why your signature is on the deposit slips for stolen corporate funds. Marcus lied to you. He told you that money was his. He told you he was setting up your future. But all he actually did was hand you a highly documented $5 million prison sentence." The girl on the grass began to weep hysterically, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as her entire world completely dissolved. Marcus suddenly scrambled out of his chair. He fell to his knees on the marble patio, crawling forward until he was just inches from the toes of my boots. He reached out his hands, hovering in the air, too terrified to actually touch me, but desperate to beg. "Maya, I can fix this." Marcus sobbed, tears and sweat streaming down his face, completely destroying his expensive grooming. "I swear to you I can fix it. I will get the money back. I will log into the Cayman account right now. I will wire every single cent back into the corporate escrow. I will transfer it directly to Apex Global. Just give me a laptop. Please, Maya. You have everything. You have the house, you have the company. Just let me put the money back and we can walk away. I will sign anything you want. I will leave the state tonight. Please do not destroy me." I looked down at the pathetic, groveling creature at my feet. The man who had spent 10 years making me feel completely worthless was now begging for his very survival. He was offering to surrender, offering to run away, believing that I still had the power to stop the avalanche that was currently burying him. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of mercy, a smile that finally revealed the absolute unyielding finality of my plan. You misunderstand this situation, Marcus, I said, softly stepping back to look down at him. I am not a judge. I am not a jury. I am simply the person who turned on the lights. I do not want your apologies. I do not want your desperate promises. And I certainly do not want you to wire stolen funds back into my corporate infrastructure. Marcus stared up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes searching my face for any sign of a reprieve. What do you mean? He gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I turned my back to him, facing the horrified crowd of investors and socialites who were now actively backing away toward the exits. It is entirely out of my hands now, Marcus, I announced, delivering the ultimate fatal strike. I did not just bring these documents here tonight to humiliate you at a cocktail party. I am a very thorough woman. I prefer to let the professionals handle corporate theft. I sent the unredacted ledgers, the offshore account details, and the complete forensic timeline to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division exactly 1 hour ago. The sheer weight of the letters FBI dropping into the silent courtyard acted like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered socialites, followed immediately by the chaotic sound of 200 elite guests frantically calculating their own proximity to the blast zone. High society loyalty is entirely conditional, and nobody wanted to be caught standing next to a man about to be indicted for a multi-million-dollar federal corporate fraud. People began edging toward the exits, whispering furiously into their phones, commanding their private drivers to pull up to the gates immediately. Marcus let out a guttural, agonizing wail. He curled forward until his forehead rested against the cold marble patio, his fingers clawing uselessly at the ground. He was completely broken, a ruined king mourning the ashes of a fake empire. I did not waste another second looking at him. My attention had already shifted to the perimeter of the pool deck. While Marcus was busy collapsing, his brilliant, opportunistic brother-in-law was attempting a tactical retreat. Spencer was moving with agonizing slowness, keeping his back to the decorative stone pillars as he tried to blend into the shadows of the manicured hedges. He was edging toward the wrought iron side gate, his head ducked down desperately, hoping the chaos surrounding Marcus would provide enough cover for him to slip off the estate and vanish into the night. "Leaving so early?" "Spencer," I called out. My voice echoed sharply over the premium sound system, cutting through the panicked murmurs of the crowd. Spencer froze instantly. He stood completely rigid against the garden wall, caught like a rat in the harsh glare of a spotlight. Every single head on the patio snapped toward him. Harrison offered a barely perceptible gesture with his left hand. Two of the heavily armed tactical contractors broke off from my protective detail and moved with terrifying silent speed across the lawn. They positioned themselves directly in front of the side gate, crossing their arms over their armored chests, entirely blocking Spencer's only exit. Spencer swallowed hard. He slowly turned around to face the courtyard, plastering a remarkably unconvincing mask of righteous indignation across his pale face. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, trying to project an air of superiority that completely failed to land. "I have absolutely nothing to do with whatever financial mess Marcus created for himself," Spencer announced, raising his voice so the remaining guests could hear him. "I am a legitimate commercial real estate developer. My firm operates independently. If Marcus committed federal crimes, that is his problem. I am leaving because I refuse to be associated with this disgraceful, unhinged public spectacle. Tell your men to step aside, Maya." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that offered him zero comfort. I walked slowly across the marble deck, leaving Marcus whimpering on the ground, and closed the distance between myself and Spencer. "You love that word, do you not?" I asked, stopping just a few feet away from him. "Legitimate. You throw it around at your country club dinners and your high society charity galas. You love playing the progressive, enlightened developer who is single-handedly saving the city. You smile for the cameras, you shake hands with the mayor, and you proudly advertise how your firm is dedicated to urban revitalization." Spencer narrowed his eyes. He crossed his arms defensively over his chest. "I build communities," he stated, his voice tight. "I create value. My record speaks for itself. You are not going to drag my name into this mud, Maya. You have no leverage over me." I signaled to Harrison. The massive high-definition projector screen above the outdoor bar flickered and changed. The ledgers detailing Marcus's embezzlement vanished. In their place appeared a highly detailed, extremely dense municipal zoning map of West Atlanta. Several residential blocks were highlighted in bright, aggressive red ink. "Let us talk about the Oakwood Revitalization Initiative," I said, pointing up at the screen. "Your crown jewel, the massive urban development project you have been soliciting millions of dollars for over the past 3 years. You stood in front of the city council and promised to build affordable housing community centers and green spaces in historically black neighborhoods." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Spencer actually shrank back, his shoulder blades pressing against the stone pillar behind him. "But you never actually broke ground, did you, Spencer?" I continued, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You set up a dozen untraceable shell companies and used them to aggressively buy out legacy properties from elderly black homeowners for pennies on the dollar. You used predatory lending tactics, aggressive foreclosure threats, and fraudulent municipal code violations to force vulnerable families out of homes they had owned for generations. You promised them relocation assistance and new units in your upcoming development. But the development does not exist." Spencer's mouth opened and closed. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Maya, you do not understand the complexities of commercial zoning," he stammered, attempting to rely on jargon to save himself. "There are supply chain delays. Municipal permits take years to secure. The capital is tied up in preliminary environmental surveys." "There are no permits," I countered, raising my voice to drown out his pathetic excuses. "There are no environmental surveys. There is no construction material. The Oakwood Revitalization Initiative is a complete phantom project. You generated glossy brochures and fake architectural renderings, specifically to secure federal community development grants and private investor capital. And once that money hit your corporate accounts, it immediately disappeared." Chloe, Spencer's wife and Marcus's sister, suddenly pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She was clutching a glass of white wine, her face flushed with confusion and rising anger. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, glaring at me. "Spencer is a visionary. He works 80 hours a week on those sites. He has millions of dollars in corporate funding." I turned my gaze to Chloe. She was just as entitled and vicious as Beatrice, but she was about to learn a very painful lesson about the man she married. "He does not have corporate funding, Chloe," I said softly. "He has your funding." Chloe stopped in her tracks. Her brow furrowed in utter confusion. "What does that mean?" I looked back at the projector screen. A new document appeared, dwarfing the map of Atlanta. It was a massive, highly complex commercial loan agreement. "Your husband's firm has been technically insolvent for 2 years," I explained, dismantling his entire reality piece by piece. He burned through all the federal grant money, paying off previous bad debts to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. But to maintain the illusion of success, to keep driving his luxury cars and wearing his custom suits, he needed a massive injection of liquid capital. He needed a $20 million commercial loan. But no bank would lend money to a phantom company with zero physical assets. I paused, letting the silence wrap around the courtyard. Chloe was staring at the screen, her eyes tracing the lines of the legal document. "So he needed a guarantor," I stated, bringing the hammer down. "He needed someone with a pristine credit history and a massive untouchable trust fund to legally secure the debt. He brought you a stack of papers last year, Chloe. He told you they were just routine tax filings for the new house. He kissed your cheek, poured you a glass of wine, and told you to just sign on the dotted lines so he could get back to building your empire." Chloe dropped her wineglass. It shattered against the deck, splashing Chardonnay across her expensive designer shoes. She stared at Spencer, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a dawning absolute horror. Spencer held his hands up defensively, his face a mask of pure panic. "Chloe, sweetheart, listen to me," he babbled rapidly. "Do not listen to this crazy woman. It is a temporary cash flow issue. The market is just slow right now. The investments will mature. I promise you the money is safe. We are completely safe." He forged property appraisals. I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. "He used your personal trust fund, your inheritance, and your individual name to secure $20 million in high-interest commercial debt. He funneled that money into his shell companies to pay off his angry investors and to fund his own lavish lifestyle. He is completely broke, Chloe. And because you signed those guarantor documents, you are legally responsible for every single penny of that $20 million debt. Chloe let out a sound that did not even seem human. It was a low, feral gasp of pure agony and rage. The realization that her perfect, progressive, wealthy husband had secretly saddled her with millions of dollars of inescapable debt completely snapped her mind. "You stole my money!" Chloe screamed, the sound tearing through her throat. "You used my name!" Before anyone could react, Chloe launched herself at Spencer. The refined, wealthy socialite vanished, replaced entirely by a woman who had just realized her entire future had been incinerated. She slammed into him with surprising force, her manicured hands curling into claws. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit, shaking him violently as she screamed directly into his face. "You parasite!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing into the night sky. "You ruined me! You ruined my life! I will kill you! I will tear you apart!" Spencer stumbled backward under the weight of her assault, his arms flailing uselessly as he tried to protect his face from her scratching nails. He tripped over a decorative planter and crashed backward into the manicured hedges, dragging Chloe down with him in a tangle of torn silk and designer fabric. They thrashed around in the dirt, Chloe screaming and hitting him while Spencer desperately tried to push her away. The remaining guests watched in absolute paralyzed horror. The untouchable Blackwell family, the pinnacle of Atlanta society, was physically tearing itself to pieces in the dirt. Marcus was weeping on the floor. Beatrice was groveling near the pool. And Spencer was being mauled by his own wife in the bushes. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt nothing but the clean, sharp edge of absolute justice. The manicured hedges of the estate, carefully sculpted over decades to project an aura of absolute serenity and wealth, were currently being crushed under the flailing bodies of Spencer and Chloe. The sounds of their struggle were visceral and ugly. Expensive silk tore with a sharp, sickening rip. Spencer grunted in pain as Chloe's acrylic nails dragged across his cheek, leaving 3 bright red, bloody streaks down his perfectly tanned skin. He shoved her hard, his hands scrambling against her shoulders, desperately trying to dislodge the woman who was currently fighting with the feral, unhinged energy of someone who had just lost $20 million. Harrison took a half step forward, his hand dropping casually to the utility belt at his waist, ready to intervene. I held up a single finger, stopping him instantly. I did not want them separated just yet. I wanted every single person remaining in this courtyard to see exactly what the great, untouchable Blackwell family looked like when their bank accounts were finally drained. The social exodus was already in full swing. The elite guests, the politicians, the bank executives, and the country club presidents were fleeing the patio as if the marble tiles had suddenly caught fire. There was no polite murmuring, no hushed farewells. It was a chaotic, panicked stampede. Women in evening gowns abandoned their expensive heels to run faster across the lawn. Men were shouting frantically into their cell phones, demanding their drivers pull up to the gates immediately. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal embezzlement scandal. They were abandoning Marcus and his family with the ruthless, practiced efficiency of high society survivalists. Within minutes, the sprawling, lavish courtyard was completely empty of guests. The catering staff had backed away into the shadows, staring in wide-eyed shock. The only people left in the center of the blinding security floodlights were the 4 members of the Blackwell dynasty, completely exposed, utterly ruined, and entirely alone. Spencer finally managed to plant his expensive Italian leather shoe against the stone planter and heave his body backward, throwing Chloe off of him. She tumbled onto the grass, her emerald gown ruined her hair, a wild, tangled mess across her face. Spencer scrambled to his feet, chest-heaving, blood dripping from his cheek onto his pristine white collar. "You psychotic woman," Spencer shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at his wife. "Keep your hands off of me. You signed those papers willingly. You did not even read them because you were too busy planning your next luxury vacation to Milan." Chloe scrambled up to her knees, sobbing so hard she was practically choking on her own breath. "You lied to me," she screamed, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it blindly in his direction. "You told me you were building a legacy. You told me we were going to be the most powerful couple in Atlanta. You used me as a human shield for your fraudulent debts. You are a complete, utter fake." Spencer let out a harsh, barking laugh, wiping the blood from his face with the back of his hand. "I am a fake." He mocked his aristocratic facade, completely dissolving into pure, vicious malice. "Look around you, Chloe. Look at your mother. Look at your brother. Your entire family is a carefully constructed illusion. You have been broke for years. I just married into a sinking ship. I used your name because it was the only thing of value you actually possessed." Marcus, who was still kneeling on the ground by the patio table, suddenly snapped his head up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "You shut your mouth!" "Spencer," Marcus snarled, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and displaced rage. "You brought this on us. You brought your shady, illegal real estate deals into my house. You dragged our name through the mud." "You dragged your own name through the mud, you arrogant fool!" Spencer fired back, taking a threatening step toward his brother-in-law. "You stole $5 million from federal escrow accounts. You embezzled from your own clients to pay for a 24-year-old mistress. Do not you dare try to pin your spectacular incompetence on me. You are going to federal prison, Marcus." Beatrice, who had been sitting paralyzed on the edge of a lounge chair, suddenly seemed to wake up. The shock of losing her diamond necklace, her social standing, and her estate finally gave way to a blinding, venomous fury. But she did not direct that fury at me. She directed it entirely at the son she had spent her entire life protecting. Beatrice stood up, her hands curled into fists, her face contorted into an ugly, hateful sneer. "How could you let this happen?" she shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing. "How could you be so incredibly stupid, Marcus? You promised me we were secure. You looked me in the eye and told me the firm was generating record profits. You let this nobody, this uneducated working-class trash orchestrate a hostile takeover right under your nose." Marcus scrambled to his feet, his own anger finally boiling over. He did not cower before his mother this time. He stepped right up to her, his face inches from hers. "I lied to you because you demanded it," Marcus roared, the veins in his neck bulging. "I stole that money because you refused to stop spending. Do you have any idea what it costs to keep you happy, mother? $50,000 a month on country club fees, private chefs, and vintage wine. You bled me completely dry. You watched me working myself to death, terrified of the regulators, and all you cared about was whether or not your precious winter gala was going to have the right imported caviar." "You are a failure," Beatrice screamed, spit flying from her lips. "You are a weak, pathetic failure of a man. Your father would be absolutely disgusted by you. You have destroyed the Blackwell legacy forever." "There is no Blackwell legacy," Marcus screamed back, his voice tearing through the humid night air. "It has been a lie since Dad died. We have been surviving on credit and Maya's secret charity for 3 years. You are not royalty, mother. You are a broke, desperate old woman who just lost the only house that gave her any value." Chloe let out another agonizing wail from the grass. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "I have $20 million in debt," she sobbed, rocking back and forth. "The banks are going to take my trust fund. They are going to take my cars. I am going to have to declare bankruptcy. What am I supposed to do, Mom? What am I supposed to do?" Beatrice turned on her daughter, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated cruelty. "Do not look at me," Beatrice snapped. "I told you to marry a wealthy man. I told you to secure your future. You are the one who chose to marry a fraudulent developer who used you like a blank check." Spencer laughed again, a dark, chaotic sound. "She married me because she is exactly like you, Beatrice. Shallow, greedy, and completely incapable of functioning in the real world. You all deserve exactly what is coming to you." I stood near the edge of the pool, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the absolute, unmitigated destruction of the people who had made it their life's mission to break me. I did not need to say a single word. I did not need to hurl insults or justify my actions. They were doing the work for me. They were tearing each other apart with the brutal, animalistic savagery of starving wolves fighting over a scrap of bone. All the etiquette, all the refined manners, all the practiced country club smiles were entirely gone. The mask was ripped away, exposing the terrifying truth of their existence. They had never actually loved each other. Their entire family bond was constructed entirely on a foundation of money status and perceived power. The absolute second the money vanished, the second the power was stripped away, their loyalty instantly evaporated. They were turning on each other, desperate to find a scapegoat, desperate to blame someone else for their own colossal failures. Marcus was pacing this patio, running his hands over his face, hyperventilating as he muttered about his lawyers and his offshore accounts. Beatrice was pacing in the opposite direction, clutching her throat where the diamond collar used to sit, cursing her children for ruining her life. Spencer was checking his phone frantically, trying to find a way out of the city, while Chloe remained on the grass, a weeping, broken shell of a woman. This was the great Blackwell family. This was the dynasty that had treated me like dirt on their expensive shoes. They were nothing but terrified, greedy children wearing borrowed clothes. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. For the first time in a decade, I felt completely, utterly free. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck were completely shattered. The debt of my grandmother's legacy was fully paid. And then I heard it. It started as a faint, distant sound drifting over the tall stone walls of the estate. A low, rising wail echoing through the quiet streets of the affluent neighborhood. Marcus stopped pacing. He froze his head, snapping toward the main gates. Spencer dropped his phone. His hands fell to his sides as the blood completely vanished from his face. The wailing sound grew louder, multiplying into a chorus of harsh, piercing sirens, cutting through the humid air. It was not just one vehicle. It was a fleet. The sound reverberated off the surrounding mansions, growing exponentially closer with every passing second. Beatrice stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared down the long, sweeping driveway. The heavy iron main gates of the estate had already been remotely opened by my security team. Through the ancient oak trees lining the drive, harsh, blinding lights began to cut through the darkness. Sweeping, violent flashes of red and blue bounced off the marble columns of the mansion, illuminating the terrified, paralyzed faces of the Blackwell family. The heavy crunch of armored tires on the gravel driveway announced their arrival. Multiple black SUVs and heavily marked police cruisers poured onto the estate, their sirens blaring a deafening song of absolute, inescapable ruin. Heavy tactical boots hit the crushed gravel of the driveway with a synchronized, deafening thud. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the courtyard, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bold, yellow letters of the FBI. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers bathed the pristine marble patio in a chaotic strobe-like glare. The perfectly manicured sanctuary of the Blackwell estate was instantly transformed into a hostile crime scene. "Nobody move!" A senior agent bellowed through a bullhorn, his voice cracking like a whip over the terrified crowd. "Federal warrant. Keep your hands where we can see them." The elite guests, billionaires, socialites, and politicians who had spent their entire lives operating above the law completely lost their composure. Women screamed, dropping their designer clutches. Men in bespoke tuxedos raised their hands instinctively in the air, pressing their backs against the stone walls and decorative pillars. The overwhelming display of federal force was completely unapologetic. A specialized tactical team bypassed the paralyzed crowd entirely, their eyes locked onto their primary targets. Marcus did not even try to run. The absolute cowardice that defined his entire existence paralyzed his legs. He remained on his knees, trembling violently, as 3 heavily armed agents surrounded him. Marcus Blackwell, the lead agent, barked, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder and jerking him roughly to his feet. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Wait, please. There is a misunderstanding." Marcus choked out his voice, cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I can pay it back. I have a trust fund. My wife has the money. Tell them, Maya. Tell them you will cover it." He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, silently begging me to deploy the financial safety net I had just ripped away from him. I did not blink. I simply watched as the federal agent spun Marcus around, slamming him face first against the glass top of the outdoor bar. "Put your hands behind your back," the agent commanded, completely ignoring Marcus's frantic sobbing pleas. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Marcus's wrists echoed sharply across the patio. It was the absolute definitive sound of his ruined life. The man who had spent a decade treating me like a worthless, disposable servant was now sobbing uncontrollably, his face pressed against the cold glass, his expensive suit stained with his own terrified sweat. Across the courtyard, Spencer was not surrendering with the same pathetic compliance. As two agents closed in on him, Spencer held up his hands, attempting to utilize the arrogant, aristocratic charm that usually allowed him to navigate his way out of minor inconveniences. "Officers, this is a massive overreach," Spencer stated, trying to smooth down his torn, dirt-stained jacket. "I am Spencer Harrington. I am a prominent commercial developer. I am personal friends with the district attorney. My wife just assaulted me, as you can clearly see. If anyone needs to be arrested tonight, it is her." The agents did not slow down. They did not care about his country club connections or his imaginary political leverage. "Spencer Harrington, you are under arrest for bank fraud, racketeering, and interstate wire fraud," the federal agent declared, stepping directly into Spencer's personal space. Spencer's eyes widened in genuine shock. He took a defiant step backward, raising his arm to shove the agent away. "Do not touch me." He snapped, his entitlement completely overriding his common sense. "I want my lawyers here right now." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The federal agents did not hesitate. One agent grabbed Spencer's outstretched arm, twisting it violently behind his back. The second agent swept Spencer's legs out from under him. The great visionary real estate developer went down hard. He crashed onto the marble deck, his jaw bouncing off the stone with a sickening crack. Spencer let out a muffled yell of pain as a heavy tactical boot pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him helplessly to the ground. The agents hauled his arms upward, wrenching his shoulders as they snapped the heavy handcuffs onto his wrists. He lay there in the dirt alongside the ruined flower beds, completely humiliated, bleeding, and stripped of every ounce of his false superiority. Chloe stood just a few feet away, her hands covering her mouth, her body shaking with fresh hysterical sobs. She watched the federal agents haul her bleeding, handcuffed husband up from the ground. She realized in that exact moment that there was no magical bailout coming. Her inheritance was gone, her name was tied to $20 million in fraudulent debt, and her husband was going to federal prison. She was absolutely, undeniably ruined. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the dark pool, the cool night breeze lifting the hem of my dress. I remained completely untouched by the violent chaos unfolding in the center of the patio. My private security detail stood like silent stone statues behind me, ensuring that no panicked guest or federal agent encroached on my personal space. I slowly turned my gaze away from Marcus and Spencer, letting my eyes sweep over the 200 captive guests. These were the people who had spent the entire evening whispering behind their hands about my working-class background. These were the women who had mocked my jewelry, and the men who had openly questioned why a brilliant financial mind like Marcus would settle for a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Now, as they pressed themselves against the walls of my courtyard, their faces were painted with absolute terror and profound awe. The Red Sea of high society parted as I took a single deliberate step forward. A prominent hedge fund manager, a man who had intentionally spilled a cocktail on my shoes 3 years ago and laughed about it, immediately dropped his gaze, refusing to make eye contact with me. The wealthy country club wives who had relentlessly excluded me from their charity committees were physically trembling, clutching their diamond necklaces and backing away as if I possessed a lethal, contagious disease. They finally understood the terrifying reality of the situation. I was not a victim. I was not a trophy wife. I was the architect of the most devastating, flawless execution of absolute ruin they had ever witnessed. I held the keys to Apex Global. I controlled the billions. I had summoned the federal government to my own patio just to dispose of the trash. I was a predator walking among domesticated sheep, and they were utterly terrified of what I might do next. From the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden, frantic movement. Beatrice Blackwell broke away from the stone pillar she had been hiding behind. She shoved her way blindly through the line of federal agents, her eyes wild, her face completely drained of its aristocratic color. She stumbled across the marble deck, her expensive gown dragging through the spilled wine and the dirt kicked up from Spencer's arrest. She did not run toward her son, who was currently being dragged toward a waiting police cruiser. She ran directly toward me. Beatrice's knees hit the hard marble with a heavy, painful thud just inches from my feet. She threw her upper body forward, her shaking hands desperately grabbing the silk fabric of my dress. "Maya!" Beatrice wailed, her voice a raw, agonizing shriek that silenced the murmuring crowd. "Maya, please, you cannot let them do this. You have to stop them. We are your family. I am your family. Please, my beautiful beloved daughter-in-law, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Please forgive me." The flashing red and blue lights cast long spinning shadows across the courtyard, creating a dizzying cinematic rotation of color and darkness around us. I stood perfectly still, looking down at Beatrice Blackwell. The woman who had spent an entire decade treating me like an infestation in her pristine world was now groveling at my feet. She clawed frantically at the hem of my gown, her meticulously styled hair, unraveling her face, a smeared, ugly mask of ruined makeup and pure terror. I reached down not to offer her grace, but to firmly and deliberately pry her manicured fingers off my silk fabric. I took a slow step back, leaving her kneeling in the damp soil of the flower beds. "Forgive you," I repeated, letting the word hang in the humid air like a physical weight. My voice was perfectly calm, an icy blade cutting through her hysterical sobbing. "You spent 10 years reminding me that I was an uncultured outsider. You made it your daily mission to ensure I knew my place. You told me that legacy and bank accounts were the only things that dictated a person's fundamental worth." Beatrice shook her head frantically, reaching out for me again, but I stepped further out of her reach. "What was it you said to me on the night of your exclusive winter gala?" I asked, tilting my head as I watched her tremble. "Ah, yes, I remember it clearly. You pulled me aside and told me that this is high society, and frauds do not belong here." I paused, letting the devastating irony of her own philosophy settle over her. "You were completely right, Beatrice. Frauds absolutely do not belong here." I turned my attention to Harrison, who stood at the edge of the patio observing the federal raid with professional detachment. Harrison commanded, my voice projecting clearly over the chaotic hum of police radios and shouting agents. "The federal authorities have their targets. As for the remaining trespassers, escort Beatrice and Chloe off my property immediately." Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her chest in absolute shock. "Maya, you cannot be serious," she choked out, looking out at the dark, sprawling lawn. "It is after midnight. Where will we go? We need to pack our things. We need to gather our bags and our jewelry." "You have no things," I stated flatly, dismantling her final illusion. "Everything in this mansion was purchased with Apex Global funds, which means it legally belongs to me. You will walk out of those gates tonight with exactly what you are wearing right now. Nothing more." Chloe let out a renewed, piercing shriek from the grass, but my private security contractors were already moving in with merciless efficiency. 2 massive guards flanked Beatrice, hauling her up by her arms despite her frantic, undignified thrashing. 2 others grabbed Chloe, dragging her away from the ruined hedges as she wept uncontrollably. "You are a monster!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as the guards physically marched her across the deck toward the dark perimeter of the estate. "You are destroying us." "I am merely balancing the ledger," I replied, turning my back on her completely. I walked toward the sweeping front driveway just in time to see the federal agents aggressively shoving Marcus toward the open door of a heavily armored police cruiser. His head was pushed down, the steel handcuffs digging into his wrists. He twisted his neck violently, fighting against the tactical agents, his desperate, terrified eyes locking onto mine across the expansive lawn. Maya! Marcus screamed, the sound tearing from his throat in a raw, animalistic howl of absolute, inescapable despair as the agents forced him inside. "Maya."